From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We have to stand together. There are no sacrifice zones. There are no sacrifice people. All of our lives, all of our land, all of our water.
In a major act of civil disobedience, over 100 water protectors have been arrested in an indigenous-led action in northern Minnesota to halt the construction of the Enbridge Line 3 tar sands oil pipeline. Many chained themselves to heavy machinery at the construction site. We'll speak to the legendary indigenous activist Winona LaDuke, who has spent years trying to block the pipeline. Then, as Vice President Kamala Harris leaves Guatemala and visits Mexico, she tells migrants don't come to the United States. We'll speak to Amnesty International's Erica Guevara Rosas about Harris's trip to Latin America, the deadly Mexican elections, and Biden's border policies.
There are other many different challenges that people are facing, including those by refugees and migrants trying to cross the border seeking asylum, the political violence in the midterm elections in Mexico, and the devastating consequences of COVID pandemic.
Then we go to Peru, where a socialist teacher has taken a narrow lead in Sunday's election over the daughter of Peru's imprisoned former dictator.
Y espero de que el día de hoy, más allá.
I hope that today, beyond the elections, Peru has to understand that we can't move our country forward if we do not unite. Our country needs to move forward from many situations, and the pandemic has demonstrated it.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In northern Minnesota, over 100 water protectors were arrested Monday in the largest act of civil disobedience to date aimed at halting the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline. If completed, Line 3 would carry more than 750,000 barrels of Canadian tar sands oil a day through indigenous land and fragile ecosystems, endangering lakes, rivers, and wild rice beds. The day of action began when over 1,000 water protectors blockaded a pipeline pump station north of the town of Park Rapids. Many of the activists locked themselves together or to heavy machinery, including bulldozers and diggers.
I'm the mother of 3 children. I trooped out here from Boston. I'm a Mi'kmaq woman. And I'm here because they need backup. They need voices. There's strength in numbers, you know? All these kids out here, I'm going to say it over and over and over again. All the kids out here deserve the future that we as parents promised our kids. And if this is how I have to fulfill that promise, then this is how I'm going to fulfill that promise, and not just for my kids, but for every kid sitting out here in this world.
Protesters are calling on President Biden to shut down the pipeline after headlines will go to northern Minnesota to get the latest from Anishinaabe activist Winona LaDuke. New data shows atmospheric carbon dioxide levels have reached their highest level in over 4 million years. Scientists with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, measured carbon dioxide levels averaging 419 parts per million in May, about 50% higher than pre-industrial levels. This comes as Amnesty International is blasting the group of 7 world leaders for failing to meet the challenge posed by the climate crisis. Amnesty said in a statement, quote, "The unambitious climate plans submitted by G7 members represent a violation of the human rights of billions of people. These are not administrative failures. They are a devastating mass-scale assault on human rights," they said. Meanwhile, June temperature records continue to fall in many parts of the world. 5 countries in the Middle East have topped 50 degrees Celsius this week, or more than 122 degrees Fahrenheit. And much of the U.S. continues to bake in extreme heat, with weekend highs in parts of South Dakota and Minnesota topping 100 degrees Fahrenheit. India has begun easing coronavirus restrictions after daily infections hit a 2-month low. India is still reporting about 100,000 cases and 2,000 deaths from COVID-19 each day. Uganda has ordered schools, churches, and markets to close and will restrict travel amidst a second wave of infections that's disproportionately affecting young people. The World Health Organization says 8 African nations have reported a 30% rise in cases in just a week. Only about 2% of people in Africa have been vaccinated against COVID-19. Norway's top coronavirus official has declared an end to the country's COVID-19 crisis. More than 22% of people are fully vaccinated in Norway, where hospitals are experiencing their lowest level of admissions in a year. Here in the United States, daily cases continue to fall, even as the pace of vaccinations has slowed to a trickle. The Biden administration now appears unlikely to hit its goal of getting at least one vaccine dose to 70% of U.S. adults by the 4th of July. In Geneva, World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus on Monday urged G7 leaders to commit immediately to sharing vaccine doses with the rest of the world.
Increasingly, we see a two-track pandemic. Many countries still face an extremely dangerous situation, while some of those with the highest vaccination rates are starting to talk about ending restrictions.
ProPublica has obtained a vast trove of IRS data showing how U.S. billionaires pay little in income tax compared to their massive wealth, sometimes even nothing. The data show Warren Buffett paid a true tax rate of just 0.1% on income of $125 million between 2014 and 2018. Over the same period, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Michael Bloomberg all paid a true tax rate of less than 3.5% as their collective wealth grew by over $100 billion. ProPublica says it will use the IRS data in the coming months to detail how the ultra-wealthy avoid taxes, exploit loopholes, and escape scrutiny from federal auditors. In Canada, police say a 20-year-old man who ran down 5 pedestrians with his pickup truck in London, Ontario, Sunday targeted his victims because they were Muslim. All 5 victims were members of a family that immigrated from Pakistan more than a decade ago. Among those killed was a teenage girl, the only survivor, a 9-year-old boy who was hospitalized with serious injuries. The suspect fled the scene but was pulled over and arrested by police a few miles from the crime scene. This is London, Ontario Police Chief Stephen Williams.
We believe that this was an intentional act and that the victims of this horrific incident were targeted. We believe the victims were targeted because of their Islamic faith.
Prosecutors are considering terrorism charges. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said on Twitter, quote, "Islamophobia has no place in any of our communities. This hate is insidious and despicable, and it must stop," he said. Vice President Kamala Harris has announced plans to work with Guatemala's government to block asylum seekers from heading to the United States. The efforts include further border militarization and a task force purportedly aimed at boosting anti-corruption efforts in Guatemala. Harris met at the presidential palace with the Guatemalan president, Alejandro Giammattei, on Monday, issuing a jarring warning to asylum seekers forced to flee Central America over poverty, violence, and the impacts of the climate crisis. Do not come to the United States, Harris said repeatedly.
The United States will continue to enforce our laws and secure our border. There are legal methods by which migration can and should occur. But we, as one of our priorities, will discourage illegal migration. And I believe if you come to our border, you will be turned back.
Blocking migrants from requesting asylum in the United States or other countries that offer the relief is a violation of international law. In her remarks, Vice President Harris also failed to acknowledge how U.S. intervention and foreign policy in Guatemala and Central America have contributed to the root causes of why people flee in the first place. Harris is meeting today with Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico City. We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast. The U.S. Supreme Court Monday unanimously ruled that undocumented immigrants who are granted temporary protective status are not eligible to seek permanent residency in the country. As many as 400,000 people from 12 countries, including El Salvador, Honduras, Haiti, and Nicaragua, are protected by TPS. Immigrant advocates say many of them were previously undocumented. In response to Monday's ruling, the National TPS Alliance vowed to keep fighting and said, quote, "This news only emphasizes the fact that Congress must act now to guarantee permanent protections and for President Biden to expand the TPS status to everyone who deserves it," they said. In Peru, where the presidential election runoff is still too close to call, leftist candidate Pedro Castillo has widened his lead against the right-winger Keiko Fujimori. Fujimori, who is the daughter of the jailed human rights abuser and former dictator Alberto Fujimori, without evidence, has claimed she believes there are signs of fraud and reiterated she won't concede yet. Meanwhile, Castillo, a former teachers' union leader who has overwhelming support from Peru's rural communities, asked his followers to remain calm as the last batch of votes are counted.
The homeland, Peru needs its children to rescue her. And thanks to every one of you, thank you for showing solidarity. We have to be respectful of the popular will, and I will be the first to enforce the will of the Peruvian people here and there.
We'll go to Peru later in the broadcast. The Biden administration says it's recovered millions of dollars in cryptocurrency paid by the Colonial Pipeline Company to hackers after a ransomware attack last month. The cyber attack left Colonial unable to bill its customers, prompting the company to shut down fuel shipments across the East Coast. The FBI says it seized a Bitcoin wallet used by the Eastern Europe-based hacking group DarkSide to collect Colonial Pipeline's payment. The news came as the Biden administration suggested it might take military action to stop ransomware attacks. This is Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo speaking Sunday with ABC's George Stephanopoulos.
Should we be contemplating military action even if these are private, not government entities?
As I said, all options are on the table. This is a top priority. And all of us in the Cabinet and National Security Council are focused on it and considering all possible consequences. This week, when the President meets with Putin and other world leaders, this will be at the top of the agenda.
Ransomware attacks regularly target school district, government agencies, and small businesses. One recent attack on a Massachusetts hospital exposed patients' sensitive medical and financial information. In another attack, hackers released a trove of internal documents from the Washington, D.C. Police Department. Thousands of websites and smartphone apps went dark around the world for about an hour this morning after a major network failure, though service was quickly restored in most places. The outage was linked to a problem with the cloud service provider Fastly. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy said Monday he has ordered the Edna Mahan State Women's Prison to close over its history of abuse. Murphy's surprise announcement came as New Jersey officials released a partially redacted report detailing sexual abuse, exploitation, physical violence, and excessive force against women prisoners by prison guards and civilian staffers. Governor Murphy said the report's findings left him deeply disturbed and disgusted. The Biden administration will defend former President Trump against a defamation lawsuit brought by E. Jean Carroll, who accused Trump of raping her in the 1990s. In a court filing with a federal appeals court in New York, the Biden Justice Department argued Monday that Trump could not be sued for defamation because Trump's rape accusation denial was done in his official capacity as president. Meanwhile, a bipartisan Senate investigation has concluded security and intelligence failures led to the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. The 95-page report makes no mention of Trump's role in inciting the violence. And in Alabama, 1,100 coal miners have entered the second month of their strike against the Warrior Met Coal Company. 6 years ago, the miners accepted a huge pay cut in order to help their company emerge from bankruptcy. Now they say Warrior Met is failing to repay them as it rakes in hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. The workers went on strike April 1st after rejecting a contract proposal they say offered too little in wages and benefits. Last month, 11 of the striking miners were arrested as they blocked strikebreakers from entering their work site.
We don't feel like we're breaking the law when this company is trying to destroy our people and their families from their livelihood.
I'll die for my family, and I'll do whatever it takes for this union right here.
The United Mine Workers says there have been 3 separate cases of vehicular assault on picketing workers by persons working for Warrior Met Coal in recent days. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, over 100 water protectors were arrested Monday in northern Minnesota in the largest act of civil disobedience to date to halt the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline. If completed, the pipeline would carry more than 750,000 barrels of Canadian tar sands oil a day through indigenous land and fragile ecosystems, endangering lakes, rivers, and wild rice beds. The day of action began when over 1,000 water protectors blockaded a pipeline pump station north of the town of Park Rapids, Minnesota. Protesters are calling on President Biden to shut down the pipeline. Indigenous activists and lawyer Tara Houska helped organize the protest.
We have to stand together. There are no sacrifice zones. There are no sacrifice people. All of our lives, all of our land, all of our water. And yet here again, we see some of the most vulnerable people of this place who are on the front lines. Black, brown, indigenous, young, queer, all these people who are typically unrepresented in those decision-making places. Yet here we are. And here are all of our accomplices together.
Tara Houska also spoke on a live stream from the construction site for the pipeline, which is already 60% built.
We love our water protectors. They're incredible. They're amazing. They're out here on the front lines defending this beautiful, beautiful territory and using their bodies, using their agency, using their hearts, using their minds, using their power to stand up for something more. We have treaty rights that were guaranteed for this place. They're in violation of that. They're in direct violation of their own laws, and we are not trespassing. This is our land. This is our territory. Enbridge is trespassing, just like all the other companies and so many other places where sovereign nations have said no.
Many of the activists at the pipeline construction site locked themselves together or to heavy machinery, including bulldozers and diggers. Authorities attempted to disperse the crowd by sending in a low-flying Customs and Border Protection helicopter, which repeatedly buzzed the protesters while producing a sandstorm on the ground. We go now to northern Minnesota, where we're joined by Winona LaDuke, the longtime Indigenous leader who has been organizing for years to block the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline. She lives and works on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, is the executive director of Honor the Earth. Her latest book is titled To Be a Water Protector. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Winona. Can you talk about this action, explain what the Enbridge Line 3 is, what the action was yesterday under the banner Treaty People Gathering?
Yes, I mean, hello out there. So we're here in northern Minnesota. First of all, I want to clarify the pipeline is not 60% done, maybe 35 or 40% done. Enbridge is vastly overrating its work. They have 67 rivers to cross, including 22 with a giant drill, the same thing that they used at Standing Rock. They're nowhere near those, and they can't even move on those rivers until July. And so they are far from done. And as they relaunched about a week ago, after a month off because of road conditions, they've come back with a vengeance. This is, in the end, intended to be a 915,000 barrel a day tar sands pipeline, the largest tar sands pipeline in the world and the most expensive. It's now a $9 billion project. Enbridge, the Canadian corporation, has been bringing oil into this country for years. They're responsible for 75% of the tar sands oil that comes into the country, and they want to shove it through these lines. Line 3 is the line that we've been fighting. It's a brand new corridor. You know, it's a brand new corridor through our prime territory of wild rice, our clam beds, our fish, all of our territory. And, you know, we've stood and tried every process to stop this. I'm someone, along with all of these other women water protectors in our tribes, we spent 7 years in the regulatory process. And now what we see is even Joe Biden sends in a helicopter to go and start hurting our people. You know, our people have had very little recourse. We have none. You know, and so now we've come to go stand, and thousands of people have come to join us. The pipeline project has proceeded, but the thing is that there's a court decision coming out at the end of June. And what Enbridge is hoping to do is to get as much of this pipeline constructed before a court might pull their permits. And what they're trying to do is what they did with the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is get the pipeline done and say, hey, it's too late. That's not going to happen. And so we're up here, and you know, thanks for looking at what's going on in northern Minnesota. But this pipeline is the same one that goes to Michigan, the one that goes under the Straits of Mackinac, where Governor Gretchen Whitmer has pulled the permit and said that's too risky to have a 63-year-old pipeline under the Straits of Mackinac. Now's the time for us to look at what this Canadian corporation is doing, because that company said they aren't going to allow that the state which issued the permit couldn't revoke the permit. That's what they said. They said Michigan. They denied Michigan's ability to revoke the permit and kicked them out. So we have a Canadian corporation coming in here trying to make a buck at the end of the fossil fuels era and run over a bunch of Indigenous people, and we're not having it.
Well, Winona, could you talk a little bit about the scene yesterday, what happened, the impact it had, and also how the police and law enforcement dealt with the protesters?
You may recall, Enbridge financed the police in northern Minnesota in a really unusual agreement where a Canadian multinational has financed a referral account any police expenses associated with Enbridge. So at last count, it was $750,000. We think it'll go to a couple million pretty quickly. Interesting idea, though, that the Canadian multinational pay for it. So they came in, a people's gathering. Those there was 2 actions, actually, which occurred yesterday. They came in for this Tree People's Gathering. I think there was like 3,000 people. I never saw.
To Assad as we fix the sound with Winona LaDuke, who is in northern Minnesota now. This is Carrie Labrador, a Native American activist who traveled to northern Minnesota from Boston. On Monday, she locked her arm to the tire of an Enbridge machine at the site and was positioned in the dirt in front of the equipment.
I'm the mother of 3 children. I trooped out here from Boston. I'm a Mi'kmaq woman. And I'm here because they need backup. They need voices. There's strength in numbers, you know? All these kids out here, I'm going to say it over and over and over again. All the kids out here deserve the future that we as parents promised our kids. And if this is how I have to fulfill that promise, then this is how I'm going to fulfill that promise. And not just for my kids, but for every kid sitting out here in this world.
Minnesota Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar expressed her support for the protesters last week, tweeting, quote, President Biden did the right thing when he canceled the Keystone XL pipeline early on in his term. Now he must do the right thing and cancel Line 3. I renew my calls to end this destructive, unnecessary giveaway to big oil, unquote. The new Line 3 route will cut across northern Minnesota. So talk about what Congress can do. Talk about what President Biden can do, Winona. I mean, one of his big acts was immediately to cancel the Keystone XL. But DAPL in North Dakota, the Dakota Access Pipeline, and Line 3, he did not cancel. Winona? We're going to go to break,
yes,
and then go ahead, Winona. Winona, go ahead. Okay, we're going to go to a break, then we're going to come back to Winona LaDuke, longtime Indigenous leader who's been organizing for years to block the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline. She lives and works on the White Earth Reservation. Stay with us. Mother Earth by Six Nations women singers. We're talking to the Indigenous leader, Winona LaDuke, who is at the action protesting, calling for the shutdown of the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline in northern Minnesota. She works and lives on the White Earth Reservation and is executive director of Honor the Earth, her latest book, To Be a Water Protector. Winona, we saw the plane, the helicopter, the CBP Border Patrol helicopter. Can you explain what its purpose was, this Border Patrol helicopter, and the sandstorm it created, and where people are coming from?
Yeah, people came from all across the country out here. A lot of church groups, a lot of Indigenous people, all kind of labor activists came out here, and they came to the Enbridge pumping station. Now, just to reiterate, Enbridge is only about 35% done, but they've entrenched at this pumping station, which, Enbridge uses a huge amount of energy to move this oil. We're up there, and I walked in there, and there was all kind of people, all kind of equipment. When I left there to go to the second gathering of another couple thousand people closing down the line at the headwaters of the Mississippi, shortly after that is when they came in with a helicopter and sticked up a sandstorm so that everybody could get all beat up by sand. And I just want to point out that's a federal agency. That's not a state agency that came in. Most of the cops have been just financed by Enbridge, but that helicopter was financed by Biden. So we're really concerned that Department of Homeland Security would come in and basically assault Indigenous people in our own homeland.
And Winona, but the Department of Homeland Security, I wanted to ask you in terms of the ability of other people within the administration to have an impact on the president, specifically the Interior Secretary, Deb Haaland, the first Native American in a presidential cabinet. Do you have hopes that she may be able to persuade the president to take a tougher stand on this issue?
Yes, we will hope that Deb Haaland will protect the trust responsibility with First Nations and Indigenous people. That's her legal responsibility. But it's even, it is other agencies. The Army Corps of Engineers issued these permits to Enbridge. We're now looking at 630 million gallons of water going to Enbridge in the middle of a drought. we're looking at that the Army Corps of Engineers issued the permits and that the federal government didn't do an environmental impact statement on this project because the Trump administration approved this project. And what we want is a federal environmental impact statement on this project because guaranteed, using the data that is known, this would not pass a climate test. This would not pass a water quality test, and it would not protect the rights, their trust responsibility with indigenous people. It will not respect our treaties.
And you mentioned a court case that will be decided at the end of the month. And what court is that, and what is the substance of what the court is deciding?
Well, the tribes and our organization, individuals and environmental organizations, and the Department of Commerce, Minnesota Department of Commerce, filed suit in state court, the state appeals court, saying that the permits, both the permit that issued the certificate of need and the environmental permits, should be overturned. The state itself is suing to overturn those permits because actually all of the projections were brought to the state agencies by Enbridge. So you're using basically the dealer to tell you how much you need, and that's a little bit questionable. And in addition to that, the EIS was failed. Was a really just a joke of an environmental impact statement. That's the decision that's going to be at the end of June. And Enbridge has brought in another 4,000 workers, and they're basically trying to run over northern Minnesota and the native people with all their security forces and all their equipment, and now the LRAD and the MRAP. We expect that soon, too, coming for us. And that's what Enbridge is trying to do, is get as much of this pipeline done by the time the court probably is going to revoke their permit. The second set of court hearings are in August, where we've already filed in federal court saying that the environmental impact statement is inadequate. We are challenging the Army Corps of Engineers. They shouldn't have issued those permits. And then finally, I want to say I'm one of the people that I have a ceremonial lodge that we put up before the line. Enbridge put a stake in our lodge and is looking to roll over those of us who've been, had ceremony there for thousands of years. So what you got is a political and a human rights and environmental crisis. We have tried to get the administration to address this because of the environmental injustice and because of the fact that you don't need 50 new coal-fired power plants when the planet is baking. We have petitioned to every federal agency, and so far we have had no response. It just seems that Joe Biden wants to see if a bunch of Indian people and older women are going to get hurt up in northern Minnesota before it's an important enough issue for Biden to look at. And that's wrong, that we should get hurt.
Winona, your protest comes at the same time new data shows atmospheric carbon dioxide levels have reached their highest level in over 4 million years. This is from scientists at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We're talking about 419 parts per million in May, about 50% higher than pre-industrial levels. As we begin to wrap up, can you talk about how this protest fits into that larger issue of the climate catastrophe, and even the G7 meeting and the grassroots groups around the world criticizing, slamming the G7 for not taking more action in this climate crisis?
Yeah, this pipeline is an ecological crisis. That's the fact. It's not only 915,000 barrels a day of tar sands oil, the climate impact, which is almost unmeasurable. I don't know what 50 new coal-fired power plants are, but it also trashes the boreal forest, which is really, really fragile. And once you start opening up the boreal forest, you got a methane time bomb that you don't want to let off. So what we need Biden and Trudeau to stop being irresponsible leaders and to stop this pipeline, because it turns out you don't need the dirtiest oil in the world running through the 1/5 of the world's water. And this is the time to stop that.
What are the next plans for the protest of thousands now in northern Minnesota?
This is just the beginning. As you may recall, we had about 250 people charged and arrested when it was minus 10 degrees out. It's now 70 degrees. It was actually 95 degrees in June in Minnesota, which is not acceptable. That's nothing that we are used to at all. It's been records and records on that. And so we are expecting that more and more people will be coming to northern Minnesota as Enbridge ramps up. I mean, remember, we have 22 rivers to cross, and everybody in Minnesota has a canoe and a kayak. And millions of people don't want this pipeline. And so we expect that tourism of water protectors and resistance will just increase.
Winona LaDuke, we want to thank you for being with us. Longtime Indigenous activist, has been organizing for years to block the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline, not to mention other pipelines. She lives and works on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, executive director of Honor the Earth. Her latest book, To Be a Water Protector. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. In her first foreign trip as vice president, Kamala Harris is in Mexico City today to meet with President Andrés Manuel López Obrador after visiting Guatemala Monday. Harris has been tasked by President Biden with blocking Central American migrants fleeing corruption, violence, and poverty from reaching the U.S.-Mexico border, even after the two campaigned on allowing more migrants to apply for asylum. Harris is the daughter of an Indian mother and a Jamaican father who both immigrated to the United States. During a press conference alongside Guatemalan President Alejandro Giammattei, she issued this jarring warning.
I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come.
In her remarks, Vice President Harris failed to acknowledge how U.S. intervention and foreign policy in Central America have contributed to the root causes of why people flee in the first place. Her visit to Mexico today comes after voters cast their ballots Sunday in one of the country's largest midterm elections in history, with about 21,000 local and national seats up for grabs. Final results are expected next week in what could be a referendum on President López Obrador's government. Preliminary results show his political party, Morena, and allies won over half of the 500 seats in Mexico's lower house, but failed to secure a supermajority. The election is also being described as one of Mexico's deadliest after human remains were found Sunday in at least 2 voting booths in the northern Mexican state of Baja California. Over 80 politicians, including 35 candidates, were killed in the run-up to Sunday's election, which took place as Mexico continues to battle the COVID-19 pandemic and is one of the world's highest case fatality rates. This is a Mexican voter.
These are the measures I am taking. I'm wearing my face mask, and I have alcohol gel. Although they gave us wipes here, it's better to be prepared.
For more on all of this, we go to Mexico City to speak with the human rights lawyer Erika Guevara Rosas, who is the America's director for Amnesty International. Erika, welcome back to Democracy Now! I mean, the story right now in Mexico is devastating. Nearly 100 politicians, at least 35 candidates who ran in this election were murdered in the lead-up.
Yes, Amy, the situation is very complex, and it really represents what has been happening in Mexico for many years. It's not only the political violence, it's the violence that is affecting the majority of the states in Mexico, it's the violence perpetuated by the organized crime, but also it's the violence perpetuated by security forces that are committing human rights violations all over the country. This political process, this electoral process has been one of the most violent. I mean, you just mentioned the numbers. It has been the most violent for women because out of the 35 candidates who have been killed over the electoral campaign, 21 were women. We have seen hundreds of reports of different types of attacks and violence against candidates and against politicians during the 200 days of electoral campaign. And unfortunately, we are seeing also President López Obrador that is denying the reality. I mean, every time that he's been asked about this political violence, he just mentioned that Mexico is in peace and that this is one of the not only historical process in terms of the number of people who are being elected for local and federal government, but he also say that it's historical because it's the first time that democracy is happening in the country while we are seeing all this type of violence all across the country.
Well, Erika, could you talk about of this violence? Is there any indication where it's coming from? Is it particular political groupings that are being targeted, or is it just a random state of the nation problem?
Well, a vast majority of the candidates who were killed and the vast majority of the attacks are against candidates of opposition parties. Politicians for opposition parties are the ones who have been targeted by this violence in different parts of the country. But it is also true that those who have been attacked are in locations where the organized crime has increased its influence over the last few years, and also where the human rights situation is worse than ever, precisely because of the strong presence of the security forces of the military. So it's difficult to say where the violence is coming from, because it's the same violence that is affecting the general population. But the reality is that it is reflective of the human rights crisis that Mexico has been facing for many years.
And Vice President Kamala Harris is scheduled to meet today with President López Obrador. Could you talk about the significance of her coming immediately after these elections in the trip to Mexico, and also what you would hope that a vice president would tell the president of Mexico at this point?
Yeah, well, Amnesty International sent a letter to Vice President Kamala Harris as soon as we learned about the trip to Guatemala and Mexico. We raised a lot of our concerns about the human rights situation in both countries, and more important, we raised our concerns about the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and these two countries, particularly because over the last few years, we've seen an increase in the level of support that these countries are getting to increase the power of the security forces, particularly to prevent migration. So we are hoping that Vice President Kamala Harris is going to have an open and honest conversation with President López Obrador, raising concerns about the human rights situation that is affecting, of course, the possibility of people to seek asylum at the border. We also need to acknowledge that many Mexicans are seeking asylum on the U.S. side precisely because of the human rights situation that the country is facing. Unfortunately, we've seen the results of the visit of Vice President Harris in Guatemala, and this very contradicting message of telling people not to come and not to seek asylum, when the reality is that there is a human rights there is the human rights of people to seek asylum that has been violated precisely because of the cruel and inhumane political policies of the Trump administration that we are seeing continue to be implemented by the Biden administration, including the closing of the border to migrants and asylum seekers, using in a very unlawful way this Title 42. So we hope that the conversation is going to lead in an understanding of the need to come up with different methods and policies to not only support people that are seeking asylum, but to provide protection to those people that are seeking asylum at the border.
Erica, when Harris met with the Guatemalan president and issued this very jarring warning, do not come to immigrants fleeing poverty, fleeing the climate crisis, fleeing violence, but not acknowledging the U.S. role in this over the decades, what has led to this crisis. Part of the efforts that are being worked out with the Guatemalan government, and I presume with the Mexican government, with the presidents, are further militarizing the border. Can you talk about what that means?
Well, that means that they are going to create more risk for people that are trying to seek asylum. You just mentioned that, Amy, these people are being forced to leave their homes. They have been forced to leave their countries precisely because of the massive violations of human rights that are happening at all levels. It's not only the inequality, but it's also the violence and the lack of protection that they are facing from their governments, particularly in Central America and Mexico. So these people are seeking asylum because it's the right to seek asylum, and governments are obliged by the international and domestic law to let people seek asylum, to protect those people who are seeking international protection. And what we are seeing over the last few years is an increase in the militarization of the response. People that are seeking asylum, people that need international protections, are being treated and seen through the lens of security. And that means that these people are being confronted to a risky reality or of being confronted by organized crime and all the many risks because they are being pushed to very risky situations and some of the more dangerous parts of the border, or they are also being confronted by the authorities who are committing human rights violations against them by committing extortion, or in very extreme cases, such as in Mexico, these people have been killed as well by security forces in collusion with organized crime.
And Erica Guevara, one of the hallmarks, supposedly, of President Biden's different approach to the refugee and migration crisis was that he was going to embark on a sort of Marshall Plan type effort to boost the economic life in Central America, to induce migrants or those who are seeking to leave to stay in the country. But what's Amnesty's assessment of how U.S. foreign aid has been used in regions especially Central America or Mexico? There was a New York Times report recently about how the bulk of the money that is apportioned out for foreign aid basically goes to U.S. contractors who take up the bulk of the money, rather than actually the money doesn't make its way down to the folks who need it.
Yeah, historically, we've seen how the humanitarian aid or the assistance that has been provided by the United States have been utilized in countries in Latin America to increase the power of security forces, and many times through the use of these private contractors. I mean, we've seen this in countries such as Colombia, and we are seeing now the consequences of this technical support in this assistance that the U.S. government has been provided to security forces. And we are seeing the same situation in Central America and Mexico. The vast majority of the resources are not going directly to support people and to address the root causes. And in spite of this narrative of all efforts to address the root causes, to improve the economic situation so that people can stay in the countries, the reality is that we are seeing the contrary. People continue to experience massive human rights violations that have been fed by impunity, corruption, by the climate crisis, and the lack of response from the governments. We are seeing now, for instance, in countries such as Guatemala, a backlash against all efforts to tackle impunity and corruption by the own government that Vice President Harris met yesterday. So unfortunately, there is no hope that only the financial assistance that the U.S. is going to be provided to these countries is truly going to address the root causes of why people are forcing to leave their countries, their homes, and take all these risks to seek asylum at the USA border.
Before we go, Erica, we wanted to ask you about the situation of COVID. In a moment, we're going to go down to Peru. Peru and Mexico have some of the highest per capita death rates from COVID in the world. It might surprise some to know that AMLO, the Mexican president, took more of the approach of someone like the far-right president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. I mean, he would wear amulets, he would hold mass rallies. Now we have news that 1 million Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccines are headed to Mexico from the United States, with most of the shots set to service resort areas and spots along the border. Can you talk about how Mexico and Peru have dealt with COVID?
But the Latin American region continues to struggle with COVID-19. We have seen that any effort to try to minimize the impact of COVID has been insufficient, even in countries such as Chile, where the vaccine rollout have improved over the last few weeks. We are seeing also an increase in the number of cases. Latin America continues to be the epicenter of the pandemic, with only 8% of the population. We have between 32 and 35 of the total death around the world, the total number of people who have died because of the virus. Just recently, a few days ago, Peruvian government acknowledged that the numbers that they were presented were lower, way lower than the real numbers. I mean, we're talking about more than 180,000 people who have died because of the virus in Peru, when the numbers reported just a few weeks ago were around the 70,000. And in Mexico, there is a similar situation where the government has acknowledged many times that the numbers that they are presented are lower to the reality. precisely because of the lack of testing and the lack of capacity to really track all the cases. So the ways that the pandemic has been affected these countries is very reflective of the lack of response and the structural challenges that these countries have been facing in terms of ensuring access to health for its population, for their populations, right? So and we are seeing now a very slow vaccine rollout in both countries, but also in many countries across the region. People seem to be trapped between the ineffective responses from the governments, the fact that rich countries are hoarding all the doses available of the COVID vaccine, but also the impunity and corruption that continue to shadow the efforts of governments to truly address the consequences of the pandemic, not only in terms of the direct impact with the number of cases, but also how the pandemic has been exacerbated, the inequalities and the economic situation for millions of people across the continent.
Erika Guevara Rosas, we want to thank you so much for being with us, human rights lawyer, America's director for Amnesty International, joining us from Mexico City. When we come back from break, we go to Peru, where a socialist teacher has taken a narrow lead in Sunday's election over the daughter of Peru's imprisoned former dictator. Her name is Keiko Fujimori. His name, Alberto Fujimori. We'll come back in a minute.
Purple skies and orange plumes, they remind me of me and you. Paint the clouds with any color you choose. Show me a smile just to think about this moment. This moment.
This Moment by Mancho Berry. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We end today's show in Peru, where the socialist candidate, Pedro Castillo, has pulled ahead of his right-wing rival, Keiko Fujimori, in the country's presidential election runoff that took place Sunday. Castillo is the son of peasant farmers. He's a school teacher and union leader who led a nationwide teacher strike in 2017, has pledged to reform Peru's constitution and mining laws. Fujimori is the daughter of the former dictator Alberto Fujimori, who's in prison for human rights abuses and corruption. On Monday, Keiko Fujimori claimed without proof that Castillo's party, Free Peru, stole votes and said she won't concede. Yet, all of this comes after Peruvian lawmakers ousted former President Martín Vizcarra in November in what some called a legislative coup. Meanwhile, the latest data from Johns Hopkins University shows Peru is tied with Mexico for the world's highest COVID-19 case fatality rate. For more, we go to Lima, Peru, where we're joined by the political scientist Carlos León Moya, who has been closely following this election. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Carlos. Why don't you lay out the state of the election results as we know them so far, with the socialist candidate Castillo narrowly ahead?
Hi, Amy. Yes, I mean, what you just said, that yesterday Keiko Fujimori claimed fraud, which, I mean, was an admission of her third loss in a row, no, in an election. Castillo has right now 87,000 votes, more than Keiko Fujimori, especially from the rural highlands, which is the country's poorest region. Keiko Fujimori was expecting to win with the Peruvian diaspora vote, especially in the United States and Spain, but the difference is very big. You know, it's very big for the votes that remain to count. So yes, so yesterday she claimed fraud, and what you have right now is the overwhelming help from the private media to Keiko Fujimori or Fujimori. No, the coverage is very biased for her, no, and against Pedro Castillo. But I think what we will have here in Peru is one more week of uncertainty, But I also think that the distance that Pedro Castillo, the leg that he has against Fujimori, is very difficult to revert.
And I wanted to ask you, in terms of the, could you talk a little bit about the crisis that has been engulfing now Peru for quite some time? Back in November, the lawmakers ousted the former president, Martín Vizcarra, and what led to Vizcarra's impeachment, and there were several other leaders in between, heads of state. How has this had an impact, even for instance, on voter turnout in this election?
Yes, I mean, you have most of Peruvian political elite charged by corruption. Keiko Fujimori was imprisoned herself 2 years ago for a corruption case. Not only his father was in prison, she also was in prison for 1.5 years. Alan Garcia, the former president of Peru, he killed himself when he was about to be taken to prison. And it doesn't distinguish from left or right-leaning. You had the former mayor of Lima, which is the capital of Peru, Susana Villarán, also gone to jail. And what the COVID crisis did was some of them, because of their age, were taken out of their jails and being sent home. So first, it was you already have in Peru a very public rejection of our political elite, and now it was bigger because most of them went to jail. When they went to jail, Martín Vizcarra was president. And Martín Vizcarra was in charge by corruption, until last year. So he was also a very popular president, no? All the political elite were in prison, and Martín Vizcarra was seen as different from them. But then the corruption charges started to be near Martín Vizcarra. I don't know if he's innocent or not, but he was also investigated by the same charges. And there was also what you just call a legislative coup, in November 2020, that ousted Martín Vizcarra, and there was huge protests in Peru, which was very unusual. Because usually when you have protests in Peru, they are on the highlands, or there are like union protests, like the one that Castillo led in 2017. But there was a huge protest in Lima, massive demonstrations in Lima, which is the capital, which is very right-leaning, and they were very successful. In 5 days, you just ousted Manuel Merino. But after that, what you just have is that it just went down. It didn't bring a renovation of the political class because the demonstrations were done when the elections were already, taking part. You have already inscribed the presidential candidates, the candidates for the Congress. So you didn't change much of the political elite or the political candidates that were going through this election. So yeah, it was a very sudden protest, a very successful protest, but you have to know it ended very sudden in November, and the election is another story. So you don't have how to make like a connection between the two of them. In fact, one of the things that we talk here in Peru is, did you remember the November protest? How hopeful we were that Peru will change its course? No, and now you see what happens. No, what happened in April in the first round was that most of the candidates have 15 or 10%. You have like 6-7 candidates that had 10% of vote intention in the polls. It was, like a political class like broken pieces. No, you have the left. You have also candidates from the far right that you didn't have. You have Fujimorismo, which is very right-leaning, but you have a far-right candidate who is called Rafael López Aliaga, who called himself the Peruvian Trump, who called himself the Peruvian Bolsonaro, and he almost got himself in the second round. So yes, sorry.
We have 10 seconds.
Yes.
You'll find out within this week, you believe, who exactly won, if Castillo maintains his lead.
Yes.
Well, Carlos Leo Moya, we want to thank you so much for being with us, political scientist speaking to us from Lima, Peru. And special thanks to Sadie Lutmer. That does it for our show. Tomorrow we'll look at a new film that's premiering at the Tribeca Film Festival. It's called Takeover, about the Young Lords. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.